got 10 years, some 3, and others shorter sentences or even just reprimands or demotions. External contractors, such as the company CACI Premier Technology, also came under scrutiny. Pretty recently, in 2024, a jury found them liable for conspiring with military police to soften up prisoners through abuse, awarding 3 former detainees $42 million in damages. Jurors concluded that CACI interrogators facilitated mistreatment even if they did not personally carry it out. Operation Speedy Express. This was one of the most brutal and controversial U.S. campaigns of the Vietnam War. You can get an idea of what really happened when you hear that the Army reported about 11,000 enemy killed, but recovered only 750 weapons from the dead. Operation Speedy Express, carried out from December 1968 to May 1969 and run under Major General Julian Ewell, had the official goal of destroying Viet Cong bases, cutting supply lines, and re-establishing U.S. control over a region considered a stronghold of the Viet Cong, the Mekong Delta. On paper, the operation looked like an overwhelming success, considering that just 242 American soldiers died, while the enemy lost 11,000. With a ratio of 45-1, it looked like a decisive victory, but the numbers hid something darker. The fact that only about 750 weapons were recovered means that thousands of those killed were probably unarmed civilians. The Army's own Inspector General later estimated that between 5,000 and 7,000 civilians were killed during the operation. The campaign relied on overwhelming firepower, like helicopter gunships, artillery barrages, and fighter bomber strikes, in a heavily crowded region with civilians. This basically turned entire areas into free fire zones. David Hackworth, a highly decorated battalion commander, admitted openly, "A lot of innocent Vietnamese civilians got slaughtered because of the Yule Hunt drive to have the highest body count in the land." Survivors and witnesses described whole villages wiped out, with civilians getting shot from the air as they tried to run. A Viet Cong commander later explained, "Most of the people killed were civilians, because civilians would run. We soldiers held our positions." Reports of atrocities began to surface in 1969, but they were overshadowed by the My Lai massacre, which we've just talked about. In 1972, Newsweek published an investigation by Kevin Buckley and Alexander Shimkin called Pacification's Deadly Price. They had interviewed villagers and studied hospital records. In one provincial hospital, they found that 3/4 of the civilian wounds treated came from U.S. firepower, not Viet Cong attacks. Their conclusion was that thousands of civilians had been killed during Speedy Express. No Gun Ri Massacre. In the summer of 1950, during the Korean War, one of its darkest tragedies took place at a railway bridge near the village of No Gun Ri. U.S. commanders were afraid that North Korean soldiers were disguising themselves as civilians, so they ordered refugee movements to be blocked. Declassified documents later showed that some commands actually went even further, authorizing troops to fire on groups of civilians who approached. Then, disaster struck. As waves of refugees fled south from the advancing North Korean army, they reached U.S. lines. There, they were stopped, searched, and grouped near the railway tracks by No Gun Ri. American planes then shot at them. Survivors say ground troops soon opened fire too, driving them into the culverts and pinning them down in the bridge underpasses. Hundreds of South Korean refugees, mostly women, children, and the elderly, were caught under fire, and for 3 days, families screamed as they piled bodies on top of one another for cover, drank from a stream turned red with blood, and watched children die beside them. The death toll has long been debated, with survivors speaking of about 400 people killed, and U.S. veterans giving numbers ranging from dozens to several hundred. A South Korean government inquiry was able to confirm 163 people dead or missing by name, along with 55 wounded, and concluded that the real toll was likely much higher, around 250 to 300. Nearly half of the confirmed victims were children. For decades, the story was silenced, as survivors lived in fear under South Korea's authoritarian governments. It was not until 1999 that the Associated Press exposed the story worldwide, interviewing survivors and U.S. veterans. The reporting won a Pulitzer Prize and forced both the U.S. and South Korean governments to investigate. The U.S. Army's 2001 report admitted that civilians had been killed by American air and ground fire, but claimed there had been no orders to deliberately massacre them. It described the killings as a tragic accident of war. President Bill Clinton expressed deep regret and admitted things happened which were wrong. Instead of compensation, the U.S. funded a memorial and scholarships, which survivors rejected. South Korean investigators, however, concluded that there had almost certainly been orders to fire, pointing to missing records, consistent testimony, and orders from the time to treat refugees as enemy agents. Later, more declassified documents strengthened the case. One was a letter dated July 26, 1950, from the U.S. ambassador in Seoul, reporting that the U.S. military had adopted a policy of shooting refugee groups approaching its lines. This and other incriminating records had been deliberately left out of the Army's official report. No Gunri also set off wider investigations in South Korea, uncovering more than 200 other cases of alleged U.S. killings of civilians in the early years of the war, including refugee bombings and mass executions. Sand Creek Massacre. On November 29, 1864, troops under Colonel John Chivington rode toward a Native American camp of the Cheyenne and Arapaho people. Chief Black Kettle had moved his people there after being told it was safe, and he raised a U.S. flag with a white flag underneath it to show peace. Many of the warriors were away, and most of the people in camp were too old or too young to fight. Despite this, Chivington's soldiers attacked. Witnesses later described women and children being shot at close range, people cut apart with knives, babies killed, and bodies mutilated for trophies. One account told of a child wandering in the sand, while soldiers took turns trying to shoot him. Another described fingers and ears cut off for jewelry, and the body of Chief White Antelope butchered. By the time the killing ended, most of the dead were women and children. Chivington claimed that 500 to 600 warriors were killed, boasting about the number, but other sources said the real number was closer to 150, with about 2/3 women and children. The soldiers suffered far fewer losses. Before leaving, they looted the lodges and returned to kill some of the wounded. The reason why this massacre happened in the first place is even sadder. In the 1851 Fort Laramie Treaty, the U.S. recognized a large Cheyenne and Arapaho homeland. But after the Colorado Gold Rush and new migration, they asked the natives for more land than was agreed, and a small group of chiefs signed the Fort Wise Treaty, ceding most of the land to appease the U.S. Many Cheyenne, though, rejected it as invalid, and tensions rose. The governor told friendly Indians to gather near forts in order to stay safe, and Colonel Chivington himself, while he declared openly that he had come to kill Indians, told those seeking peace to come under military protection at Fort Lyon. That's exactly what Black Kettle did, following his instructions, but his people were pushed out. He still believed the U.S. and white flags would protect them, but the massacre happened. In Colorado and Washington, the story was first reported as a victory, but the truth quickly surfaced. 3 investigations followed, including a congressional inquiry that called it a foul and dastardly massacre. Officers and scouts testified about the killings and mutilations. Captain Soule, who had refused to fire, gave evidence and was murdered shortly after in Denver. Despite the findings, no one was court-martialed. Chivington had already resigned, and while his career ended in disgrace, he avoided legal punishment. A later treaty at the Little Arkansas promised survivors land access and reparations, but those promises were soon broken and replaced with much smaller reservations. Philippines concentration camps. During the Philippine-American War, concentration camps were used in Batangas, and one American officer described them as some suburb of hell. You'll soon understand why. Back then, General James Franklin Bell took command of U.S. forces in that area, and his goal was to starve the rebels and cut them off from any support. However, since there were many civilians there, they decided to put them into heavily guarded camps, as their homes, fields, and animals were destroyed. All civilians were required to carry identification papers, and anyone found outside the camps without them could be shot on the spot. Bell himself said neutrality should not be tolerated, which meant that everyone was either an enemy or a friend, and anyone accused of helping the rebels risked execution. Conditions inside the camps were catastrophic. People were packed together in crowded spaces with poor sanitation, which made diseases spread quickly. Cholera, smallpox, beriberi, and even bubonic plague killed thousands. Food was also scarce, and some soldiers described groups of men being forced to dig their own graves before being executed, with the excuse that keeping them alive would take food away from U.S. troops. Torture was also performed, such as waterboarding. The death toll was incredible. Between January and April 1902, 8,350 people died in the camps. In some camps, as many as 1 out of every 5 prisoners died. To calm public anger in the United States, the Army's top public relations officer tried to defend the camps. He claimed they were meant to protect friendly natives, feed them, and teach them better hygiene. However, this claim collapsed when reports from inside the camp surfaced, with letters from soldiers and witnesses. Wounded Knee Massacre. Before sunrise at Wounded Knee Creek, cavalry surrounded the Native American band of Lakota and began collecting their guns. Tension grew as soldiers searched the people, and a deaf Lakota man named Black Coyote held onto his rifle, and during a struggle, it went off. In that instant, soldiers opened fire on the entire camp, even though most Lakota men had already been disarmed. The Army's Hotchkiss guns fired into the tents where women and children were hiding. In less than an hour, more than 250 Lakota were killed or fatally wounded. 25 U.S. soldiers were also killed. Survivors tried to flee, but they were chased and shot, and some soldiers finished off the wounded where they lay. A blizzard followed the massacre, and 3 days later, civilians gathered the frozen bodies and placed them in a mass grave. 4 infants were found alive, still wrapped in their mother's shawls. The Army removed Colonel Forsyth, who had led the operation, but later reinstated him. An inquiry criticized his tactics, but did not blame him. 19 medals of honor were then awarded for Wounded Knee. Native leaders and many others have condemned those awards for decades, but most recently, in 2025, the Defense Secretary announced the medals would not be revoked.